Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Tony Cascardi, and as the director of the Townsend Center at Berkeley, it's a pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon. I want to say a special word of thanks to our colleagues in the English department who have been very generous in allowing us to use this handsome Maud Fife room this afternoon. For those of you who aren't familiar with the room or the location, about an hour from now, you'll hear the campanile singing out 5 o'clock, calling the other scholars busily at work elsewhere to their rest, but we'll be then proceeding to what I expect will be a very lively set of questions following Adam Phillips' talk. Some of you know the Townsend Center in recent years has developed a program devoted to the humanities and the public world. And these have been lectures and panel discussions, seminars with prominent writers, intellectuals, and artists, all focusing on the connections between the lives that we publicly live and share, our civic lives in many instances, and some of the more inwardly directed concerns of the humanities. And you may have noticed, or maybe not, in which case I'll call it to your attention now, that this afternoon's talk by Adam Phillips on Freuds Helplessness might better be situated as part of a hypothetical series antidote to that one about the public world, being, as its title suggests, about a figure who was far more drawn to contemplate our private worlds than to anything public about us. Although, of course, that's not entirely true, and those distinctions break down rather rapidly. So the idea of a forum on the humanities and the private world might seem like a bit of a redundancy standing in for a joke, but if there's anyone who could disprove that thought, I think it would have to be Adam Phillips. He's formerly the chief child psychotherapist at Charing Cross Hospital in London, and the author of a wide range of books about our not-so-private lives, with fascinating titles like Houdini's Box, Going Sane, and On Flirtation. They treat an astonishingly broad range of subjects, from the poetry of Emily Dickinson being one of the escape artists of Houdini's Box, to the matters of worrying, boredom, tickling, and so forth. Truth be told, he has in fact ventured into questions of politics in his book Equals, but mostly has remained adherent to a broadly psychoanalytic interpretation of Socrates' dictum that only the examined life is worth living. There's plenty of examination in his work, but never at the expense of a prose that is always fascinating, supple, and surprising in many ways. Phillips, as you may know, is the general editor of the new Penguin edition of the selected works of Sigmund Freud, and a contributor to the London Review of Books, as well as many other publications. Before turning the microphone over to him, and by way of doing so, I thought I'd just share with you one of those strange, kind of weird moments that can only happen in the Google age. I was searching under Adam Phillips a couple of weeks ago for some information about some of his earlier works, and was presented initially with 3 sort of starred results. The first was a book entitled Monogamy. The second, The Book of Mormon, Another Testament of Jesus Christ, which no doubt has something to say about monogamy, or not. And the third, entitled Red Hot Monogamy. It seems that all of these are available or were then new and used from prices ranging from $9.59 to a penny. The real Adam Phillips is, of course, also the author of Monogamy, which the New York Observer described as characteristically playful, brilliant, and profound. Those are indeed the words that come to mind in describing him, and I now have the great pleasure of welcoming Adam Phillips to the podium.
Thank you very much. The paper is called Freuds Helplessness, and the epigraph to the first section is from Auden's poem, Mundus et Infans. We should never dare offer our helplessness as a good bargain. Without at least promising to overcome a misfortune we blame history or banks or the weather for. But this beast dares to exist without shame. I am myself alone, Richard Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, boasts, towards the end of the third part of Shakespeare's Henry VI. And to modern ears, there's the ambiguity of his being both by himself and only himself. But he was also living in what we've come to call an enchanted world of spirits and demons, and indeed of God. There was a limit set to how alone he could claim to be, and indeed a limit set to how much of his singularity he could claim to know. Conscience is but a word that cowards use, he suggests, in a covert acknowledgement of his own cowardice, and of what we might want to think of as a disavowed part of himself. He's registered the word, but only as a word, and only as a word used by others. I am myself alone as a boast rather than a plaint is a description of what Richard thinks he's been able to dispense with. It's the claim of a character one critic has called a sardonic narcissist. A narcissist is a person for whom the need for others is a conundrum. The sardonic are, in the words of the OED, bitter, scornful, and mocking. Richard, we can say, implicitly but consistently ablates his own helplessness. His language about himself, in all its tortuous and subtle dissimulation, insists on his own invulnerability, or rather, it is an attempt at invulnerability, which is always linked with sadism. So it's of interest, I think, that one of Shakespeare's three uses of the word helpless is in Richard III. The other two are in the Comedy of Errors. The first use of helplessness cited by the OED is 1731, and it is, I imagine, of some significance that it's a term that's first used in the 18th century. The word is used early in the first act by Lady Anne as she's brought the dead body of her father-in-law, King Henry VI. The man who, within the space of the play, will become Richard III, has had both her husband and his father murdered, and will eventually marry her. But at this moment in the play, she's faced with the king's body and the impending catastrophe. Looking at his wounded body and weeping, she says, "Lo, in these windows that let forth thy life, I pour the helpless balm of my poor eyes." She's helplessly crying, and her tears, the helpless balm, can't help the dead king or herself. What she can't help but express, the tears she is shedding, are no help. Her helplessness is no help to her. It is, of course, a familiar topos that helplessness can't be helped and is no help. Consider Beckett's ill-seen, ill-said. Quote, "She sits on, erect and rigid, in the deepening gloom. Such helplessness to move she cannot help." And the ineffectuality of tears is a continual theme. In this case, her tears can neither bring him back to life nor stem the evil that is Richard. Nothing can make her tears helpful balm. Indeed, helpless balm is a contradiction in terms, because if it's helpless, it isn't balm at all. In this desperate scene, nothing can be done. Helplessness is tantamount to hopelessness. Lady Anne can refer to the king's dead body as a holy load, but again, to our modern or rather secular ears, it could be, as such scenes more obviously are in Shakespeare's later tragedies, in miniature a scene of what we've learned to call from Weber disenchantment, the acknowledgement that there is no redemptive magic. Can we experience helplessness? Can we notice that there may be such a thing as helpless balm without needing to re-enchant the world? That is to say, without talking of religious providentialism of one kind or another, or now of the wonders of science and technology, or indeed of art. Can we acknowledge our helplessness and do without what Leo Bassani has called the culture of redemption? How has it come about that something so fundamental to our being as helplessness is akin for us to hopelessness? Richard, we might think, and as Freud did think, enacted a malign solution to his own helplessness. What would a benign solution be? Why, to put it as starkly as possible, does our helplessness so often tend to make us what we call bad? In some character types met within psychoanalytic work in 1916, Freud uses Richard III as his example of what he calls the exceptions. Those people whose neuroses, Freud writes, quote, were connected with some experience of suffering to which they had been subjected in their earliest childhood, one in respect of which they knew themselves to be guiltless, and which they could look upon as an unjust disadvantage. The privileges they claimed as a result of this injustice and the rebelliousness it engendered had contributed not a little to intensify the conflicts leading to the outbreak of their neurosis. End of quote. The exceptions have suffered something they could do nothing about and made a privilege of necessity. They've been inspired, so to speak, by a bad bout of helplessness. Richard, in his opening soliloquy, says, as paraphrased by Freud, quote, "Nature has done me grievous wrong in denying me the beauty of form which wins human love. Life owes me reparation for this, and I will see that I get it. I have a right to be an exception, to disregard the scruples by which others let themselves be held back. I may do wrong myself, since wrong has been done to me." End of quote. The exceptions in Freud's examples are not the agents of their undoing. Their victimhood becomes a form of entitlement. For Richard, it is, in a sense, an opportunity to invent his own morality, or at least to exempt himself from the morality of others. "I that am curtailed of this fair proportion," he says in the famous soliloquy quoted by Freud, "cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them." Freud, as we shall see, comes back to this stark image of being sent before our time into this breathing world, scarce half made up. Richard, Freud remarks, quote, "is an enormous magnification of something we find in ourselves as well." It's an image of Richard's original helplessness. It is a predicament inflicted. Like Lady Anne's helpless balm of tears, he couldn't help it happening to him, and this became, through his self-cure for it, no help for him or others. None of us choose our feature. We all think we have reason to reproach nature and our destiny for congenital and infantile disadvantages, Freud writes, commenting on Richard's soliloquy. We all demand reparation for early wounds to our narcissism, our self-love. Freud, as we shall also see, turns this fundamental situation, what we make out of our original helplessness, into an explanation of the origins of culture, of morality, of religion, and of art. If we all have a sense of ourselves as helplessly disfigured in early childhood, we must have a picture, a sense of what it would be not to be so disfigured. The if-only life that will inform our grievance. Something was done to us, or, as in Richard's case, it was as though something was done to us and we were helpless. Either it couldn't be helped or no help was available. Helpless then means unprotected. It means, in this context, having an impotence foisted upon us and organizing a life around that fact. In this story, it's clearly not part of our narcissism, part of our self-love, to be helpless in this way, or it's part of a negative narcissism, the specialness conferred by my exceptional suffering. And if it wasn't for this helplessness, we would not suffer in the way we do. What is being conjured here is a counter-image of invulnerability, the opposite of helplessness. In this equation, it is our helplessness that makes us so narcissistically vulnerable, that makes our self-love so precarious. The hell of the narcissist, Serge Wiedemann once remarked, is the tyranny of his need for the other. There is helplessness, in other words, and there is the lure of self-sufficiency, of creating the illusion of being everything to oneself. And yet, of course, in a certain sense, helplessness is where we start from. Or, as object relations theorists put it, dependence is where we start from. Either we can't get round the fact that, as Winnicott put it, all philosophers were once babies. I want to consider in this paper Freud's story about helplessness with a view to making a case for it. A case for helplessness as something we shouldn't want to think of ourselves growing out of. We can become more competent, but we shouldn't imagine that we can become less helpless. The wonderful phrase, learned helplessness, reminding us, of course, that it can be learned and also unlearned. Moral philosophy, Charles Taylor writes in Sources of the Self, has tended to focus on what it is right to do rather than what it is good to be, on defining the content of obligation rather than the nature of the good life. It has no conceptual place left for the notion of the good as the object of our love or our allegiance, or, as Iris Murdoch portrayed it in her work, as the privileged focus of attention or will. End of quote. In psychoanalysis, the question, I think, has always been about what it is right to do about helplessness, rather than about helplessness as integral to the nature of the good life, or indeed as the object of our love or our allegiance. I think it should be the privileged focus of our attention, though probably not of our will. In the story I'll be telling, and that Freud in some ways tells and in some ways doesn't, acknowledgement of dependence is no more of a solution to helplessness than the injunction to pull up your socks. And this is partly because helplessness is more often than not assumed to be the problem or what we are suffering from, rather than a pleasure, a strength, or a virtue. It's not something, as it were, that we cultivate. We do not think of development as a project in which we want to become increasingly helpless. or one in which we elaborate and sophisticate our capacity for helplessness? One of the moral questions ushered in by psychoanalysis is, what kind of good are the things we can't help but say or do or feel or think or desire? I want to add to this the question, what good is helplessness? A question that perhaps inevitably exercised Freud. Indeed, virtually everything Freud wrote was about not only what can't be helped and what can, but also, and more interestingly, about the moral consequences of our helplessness. So, what is called helplessness, and what good, if any, could it be? In a section of Freud's early project for scientific psychology entitled The Experience of Satisfaction, Freud is trying to give an account in neuronal terms of how the infant, the rudimentary person, manages the stimulation of appetite. It's an interesting passage, not least because it shows Freud using the language of science in a way that leads him into the language of morality. In the terminology of the project, we see that once the experience of satisfaction becomes the topic, the language of neurology becomes permeable to moral preoccupations. What Freud calls relief of tension, discharge, turn inevitably into questions about the good, about adequate ethical objects, and moral motives. Freud is working out an account, though this is not how he would have put it, of what the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre calls, quote, the distinctive virtues of dependent rational animals, whose dependence, rationality, and animality have to be understood in relationship to each other. When Freud talks of the experience of satisfaction, he's talking in the first instance of what is conducive to survival, and in the second instance, as it were, to put it rather more ambitiously, about what might be conducive to human flourishing. Satisfaction is the word, the experience that links what we've learned to call our desire and our obligation. And Freud, unsurprisingly, can't talk about any of this without invoking the idea of helplessness, without indeed making the helplessness of the human infant the heart of the matter. This is a long quote. Experience shows, Freud writes, keeping things as empirical as possible, that once appetite occurs, the first path to be followed is that leading to internal change, e.g. emotional expression, screaming, or vascular innervation. But no discharge of this kind can bring about any relief of tension, because endogenous stimuli continue to be received in spite of it. Here, a removal of the stimulus can only be effected by an intervention, which will temporarily stop the release of quantity in the interior of the body. And an intervention of this kind requires an alteration in the external world, e.g. the supply of nourishment or the proximity of the sexual object. And this, as a specific action, can only be brought about in particular ways. At early stages, the human organism is incapable of achieving this specific action. It's brought about by extraneous help, when the attention of an experienced person has been drawn to the child's condition by a discharge taking place along the path of internal change, e.g. the child screaming. The path of discharge thus acquires an extremely important secondary function, viz. Of bringing about an understanding with other people. And the original helplessness of human beings is thus the primal source of all moral motives. When the extraneous helper has carried out the specific action in the external world on behalf of the helpless subject, the latter is in a position, by means of reflex contrivances, immediately to perform what is necessary in the interior of his body in order to remove the endogenous stimuli. The total event then constitutes an experience of satisfaction, which has the most momentous consequences in the functional development of the individual. End of quote. The picture is of the desiring helpless subject filling from within with stimuli and seeking in the first instance relief through physical expression. This reflex magic fails because the stimuli of desire keep coming. What Freud calls the release of this quantity can only be effected by an intervention by someone else, someone outside. These specific actions, put in inverted commas by Freud, can only be brought about in particular ways. The supply of nourishment or the arrival of the sexual object, depending upon the attentiveness, the quality of attention of someone else, and their generosity. The essential thing without which the child quite literally would not survive is provided by someone else. Desire is made viable by its recipient. It's worth noting that by equating here in this way the supply of nourishment with the proximity of the sexual object, Freud is making them equally urgent needs, making us wonder what happens to the sexually desiring subject, the helpless subject, as Freud calls him, if his sexual need is not attended to, given we know what happens to the unattended baby. But in some ways, it's a simple point. The helpless subject needs help. Help is not something added on afterwards, it is integral. There is no position, no stage or state before helplessness, and there is no stage before what we call help is required. But then Freud makes his remarkable statement almost as an afterthought. This path of discharge, that is the scream, the emotional expression, thus acquires an extremely important secondary function, bringing about an understanding with other people. And the original helplessness of human beings is thus the primal source of all moral motives. The first function of the scream is an attempt at evacuation, at a discharge of stimuli which can't work. But the secondary function is as an appeal, a medium of communication or contact between the helpless subject and the person looking after him. It brings about an understanding with other people, presumably because it stimulates the other person to work out, to imagine what it might be that the helpless subject is in need of. It makes the other person think about what might be good for the helpless subject, and presumably about whether it's good for this other person to try and provide what is needed. The original helplessness, Freud writes, is thus the primal source of all moral motives. Moral motives might be construed as predispositions or reasons or causes to pursue the good. It's a usefully ambiguous phrase in the translation. Is the original helplessness of human beings the primal source of all moral motives in the infant as helpless subject? Or does the infant's helplessness and the sexual adult's helplessness call up moral motives in the recipient? Does our original helplessness make us moral, or is morality prompted in us by the way we respond to dependent others? Freud is making a link between our original helplessness and the primal source of all moral motives, as though he's saying, without original helplessness, there would be no moral motives. As though, however it works, morality is what we've invented, what has been summoned up in us by our helplessness. Because we are originally helpless subjects, though by linking the hungry infant with the desiring sexual adult, Freud is more than intimating not merely an original helplessness, but an enduring or constitutive helplessness. Because we are originally helpless subjects, we can't separate out obligation from need. We cannot help but consider what we need to do to, for, and with the people upon whom we depend. To be a helpless, desiring subject is to be implicated, to be enmeshed in, and inextricable from, a world of moral considerations. And one of the things, of course, that this will involve us in are attempts, however forlorn or desperate or intermittent, to want to separate out desire and obligation. The way we tend to do this is to disavow helplessness. Once we keep helplessness in the picture, put it as Freud does in the middle of the picture, we can't dissociate appetite and morality. You can only say, as Richard does, I am myself alone, as a boast, rather than as a statement of despair, if you found a way of creating the illusion that you are not in any way what Freud calls a helpless subject, a subject who needs help, who is indeed only a subject at all because he has been helped. It is original helplessness that leads us to, that makes necessary, the idea of the good. But of course, Freud doesn't say the original helplessness of human beings is thus the primal source of all good moral motives. He just says morality is bound up with helplessness. So it's worth recalling Charles Taylor's comment quoted earlier that, quote, moral philosophy has tended to focus on what it is right to do rather than what it is good to be, on defining the content of obligation rather than the nature of the good life. Morality, we might say now, is what we've tended to do with original helplessness. Morality is what we've made out of it. It is, at least in Freud's view, but these are my words, not his, our self-cure for better and for worse for the fact that we are helpless subjects. And the problem, we might say, is that we've tended to be, or have been tempted or inclined to be, more like Richard. And by that I mean we could begin to see that much of our discontent with morality, much of our sense when it exists that morality is alien rather than integral, a foreign body foisted on us to deprive us of our real satisfaction, comes from the ways in which we can use morality to deny, abolish, refuse, disparage, trivialize, and punish our original helplessness. Or to put it another way, or to put it the other way round, any morality that does not affirm desire and value helplessness is merely punitive. That any morality that's not on the side of helplessness, that can't bear to see its pleasures and its strengths, is going to feel estranging. So we need to consider what might have to happen to original helplessness that might make it a vice rather than a virtue, a persecution rather than a boon. What would make us so averse to what is so original about us? And at least in the passage from the project, Freud has a fairly obvious answer to this question. Helplessness becomes persecution, is made into a problem by being insufficiently responded to. If the hungry infant's needs are not at least recognized, if not always actually met, if the sexually desiring adult finds no object attentive to his desire, helplessness becomes intolerable. Something has to be done with it. It might be turned, for example, into omnipotence, or bitter, scornful, mocking behavior, which may be the same thing. But this is the reassuring, commonsensical account, one that's been taken up in various versions of object relations theory. It's not our nature that is the problem, but it's our parenting that makes it so. You'll notice in this account that helplessness is the precondition for being helped. As an experience in itself, as in the developmental theories of psychoanalysis, it's not a good one. It is what it leads to that is of paramount importance. That is, the possibility of being understood and the generation or evocation of all moral motives. Helplessness is the precondition for human bonds, for exchange. You have to be a helpless subject in order to be helped, in order to be understood, in order to become a moral creature. Helplessness, in other words, can make us good. And so by the same token, if you can't experience helplessness, you're precluded from these fundamental human experiences. To get back, or to be brought back to helplessness, is to be brought back to these things. So we shouldn't underestimate from this point of view the conscious or unconscious desire for helplessness that must exist alongside the wish to refuse it. We could indeed think of ourselves as suffering from an incapacity or a refusal of states of helplessness, precisely because they reconnect us with these things that helplessness makes possible. Logically, of course, states of helplessness are to be avoided. Freud gives us a picture both of why they might be desired and the risks of desiring them. For Freud, it's only this helpless subject that's capable of experiences of satisfaction. These experiences he describes as having, quote, momentous consequences in the functional development of the individual. No helplessness, no satisfaction. Helplessness that is so difficult to find a picture of for the adult that is not simply terrifying is the precondition for satisfaction. If we lose or forget or repress or project or attack this original helplessness, we quite literally lose, in Freud's terms, the real possibilities for satisfaction. We become one of the exceptions, like Richard. Without helplessness, there can be no possibility of satisfaction, and without the possibility of satisfaction, there can be no aliveness, no point. Helplessness, Freud is suggesting, is the most important thing about us. And yet, as he also says, helplessness is the very thing that we are prone to magic away, largely through religion, but also through art and morality, and so by implication, by theory. If we can't bear helplessness, we can't bear satisfaction. There is a plot against helplessness, which turns out to be a plot against satisfaction. Real satisfaction, Freud implies, depends upon living without illusions, without the wishful magic of religious beliefs. The experience of satisfaction literally depends upon our living in Weber's disenchanted world, a world without omnipotence in it. The psychical origin of religious ideas, Freud writes in The Future of an Illusion, which are given out as teachings, are not precipitates of experience or end results of thinking, they are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. The secret of their strength lies in the strength of those wishes. And we already know the terrifying impression of helplessness in childhood aroused the need for protection through love, which was provided by the father. And the recognition that this helplessness lasts throughout life made it necessary to cling to the existence of a father, but this time a more powerful one. Thus, the benevolent rule of a divine providence allays our fears of the dangers of life. The establishment of a moral world order ensures the fulfillment of the demands of justice, which have so often remained unfulfilled in human civilization. And the prolongation of earthly existence in a future life provides the local and temporal framework in which these wish fulfillments shall take place. End of quote. This is, as many people have noticed, a rather sweeping account of religion. But over 30 years after the project, once again, everything comes out of the helplessness of childhood. Though certain things have now changed. First of all, the original helplessness of human beings has become for the older Freud the terrifying impression of helplessness in childhood. And what this helplessness produces is not here the experience of satisfaction, but the illusions of religion, with its all too plausible morality that is merely a wishful concealment of our real helplessness faced with the dangers of reality. Now helplessness only prompts us to obscure its existence. It's not the route to satisfaction, but the route to a knowing self-deception. And this deception can only be made complete by wheeling on a spurious father figure. In the project, it was at least implied that the infant's helplessness would be met by the mother, and the adult's sexual desire would be met by a satisfying real object of no specified gender. Here, the solution to helplessness, which is in fact an evasion of it, is a faked-up father. Freud, we might infer, now believes that the majority of modern people can only turn against helplessness, satisfaction, and truth. They take refuge in religion and its morality because, unlike the helpless subject of the project, they can't bear or bear with their own helplessness. It makes them invent a cartoon character, a parody, a man without disabilities, a man beyond help. The epigraph to the second section of this paper is from Paul Eluard, and it is, "There is another world, but it is in this one." There are, let us say, two solutions that Freud proposes to our original human helplessness, a good one and a bad one. In the good one, helplessness is the precondition of satisfaction, the only way to the experience of satisfaction, and by the same token, the only way to morality. In the bad one, the experience of satisfaction is replaced by the experience of feeling protected. Helplessness issues in the wish to be protected from the experience of helplessness, not to feel it too acutely. Helplessness is not recognized, so to speak, as a predisposition towards sensuous satisfaction. It's as though someone has said, "I need a drink," and the other person has replied, "It's not a drink that you really need. You need your thirst to be made safe." Or as though someone has said, "I'm hungry," and the other person has replied, "No, you're terrified." So helplessness leads to satisfaction or to self-deception. It produces understanding between people at best, or misunderstanding. And in both versions it leads to morality. The undisclosed morality of Freud's phrase in the project, the primal source of all moral motives, or the morality Freud clearly despises, of the religiously consoled. It is, one might say, the difference between those who can bear being children and those who can't. Believing in religion is like believing that adulthood is the solution to childhood. Religion, for Freud, is the false solution to human helplessness. The human helplessness that Freud is keen to insist lasts throughout life. It just begins in childhood. And satisfaction is the right solution, or perhaps we should say, the right outcome. But either way, all of what we think of as our moral problems come out of the fact that we are helpless subjects. And helplessness, or our relation to it, is something Freud thinks we need to get right. And we do the very worst things when we get it wrong. We start doing things like believing in God, or abiding by religious teachings, or adopting preposterous moralities, or believing that we are exceptional creatures rather than just another species of animal. Obviously, if frustration makes us aggressive and we turn against our own satisfaction, we are unconsciously cultivating our violence by disavowing our helplessness. Our fundamental response to our own helplessness is to create an enchanted world, a world in which we seek protection from our helplessness but not engagement with it. Biologically speaking, Freud writes in his paper on Leonardo da Vinci in 1910, religiousness is to be traced to the small human child's long drawn-out helplessness and need for help. And when, at a later date, he perceives how truly forlorn and weak he is when confronted with the great forces of life, he feels his condition as he did in childhood and attempts to deny his own despondency by a regressive revival of the forces which protected his infancy. It's almost as though the child underestimates his helplessness, or that what adulthood brings is a sense of just how helpless we really are. It's important, I think, that Freud nowhere suggests that we grow out of our helplessness. Indeed, he suggests here that we grow into it, or that it's something that can be realistically overcome. Of course, it can't be. For Freud, religion is a poor solution to an endemic, to a biological problem. It's because we are helpless when confronted with what he calls the great forces of life that we engage in this imaginative activity called religious belief. In Freud's view, our helplessness doesn't diminish over time, but we become progressively more disturbed by it. So terrorized are we by it that we will seek safety rather than satisfaction, magic rather than nourishment, disavowal rather than acknowledgement. We seem, in Freud's view at least, to be the animals who are tormented by our helplessness, the animals for whom it is, or it has become, the abiding preoccupation. And in explaining this in Inhibition, Symptoms and Anxiety in 1926, Freud has recourse to, or rather seems to allude to, Richard III's soliloquy that he quoted in his paper on the exceptions. The biological factor, he writes, that makes us so prone to neurosis as a species is the long period of time during which the young of the human species is in a condition of helplessness and dependence. Its intrauterine existence seems to be short in comparison with that of most animals, and it is sent into the world in a less finished state. As a result, the influence of the real external world upon it is intensified, and early differentiation between the ego and it is promoted. Moreover, the dangers of the external world have a greater importance for it, so that the value of the object which alone can protect it against them and take the place of its former intrauterine life is enormously enhanced. The biological factor then establishes the earliest situations of danger and creates the need to be loved, which will accompany the child throughout the rest of its life. End of quote. Richard described himself as deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world. Freud's human animal is too briefly in the womb and sent into the world in a less finished state. And Freud, of course, intimates there may be a sense in which we are all deformed by our protracted helplessness and dependence. This left Richard with a grudge and a supposed entitlement to avenge himself, at least in Freud's view. What is the grudge? What form does the revenge of the human animal take? The value of the object that can protect it is enormously enhanced, and the need to be loved will accompany the child throughout the rest of his life. What sense, then, does it make to think of ourselves deformed by our dependence? What picture of ourselves might we have if we were not so deformed? The long period of time that the human species is in a condition of helplessness and dependence leads to what we might call an idealization of the protecting object, i.e., an unrealistic apprehension of it, and a cravenness, an enslavement to being loved. Richard we might think of as idealizing himself and enslaved to being hated. This helplessness that accompanies us throughout life calls up in us the wish for a protective object that distorts perception and a terror of the loss of love. In other words, at its best, under one kind of description, our helplessness involves us with others. It weaves us into the human community. But at its worst, under another description, it makes us abject and infinitely exploitable creatures. We will do anything for love and protection. As though our original helplessness, the defining feature of ourselves throughout our lives, at worst corrupts us, and at best makes us morally pragmatic rather than moralistically principled. If we live in a condition of dependence and helplessness, and what this leads us into is spurious, self-deceiving religious consolation, or the secular equivalents, how could we not end up hating our and other people's helplessness? How could we not end up thinking the absurd paradoxical thought that the very thing that makes us what we are ruins our lives? This, at least, is one of the places that Freud leaves us. The catastrophe of being a human being is that we are irredeemably helpless creatures, and that means helpless to do anything about our helplessness. We are essentially helpless, and that is the very thing that makes our lives impossible. It is a mark of our resistance to our helplessness that we deem the inevitable to be catastrophic, as though anything we don't make ourselves must be bad for us. The third and final section to the paper has an epigraph from Geoffrey Hill's essay, The Eloquence of Sober Truth. And it is, that innate incompetence which Hooker had called this our imbecility. Freud is making a distinction, though over time it's a distinction that gets lost, that at first sight seems rather crude. Our original helplessness either leads optimally, as it were, to the experience of satisfaction or to the experience of religious belief, to essential sensual satisfactions of appetite or to magic. But in making this distinction, by setting up these contraries, Freud is opposing protection to satisfaction. Our helplessness, that is the helplessness of appetite, can lead us in the direction of the experience of satisfaction provided by attentive others. Or our helplessness in the face of the dangers of the external world and the great forces of life, among which are appetite, can lead us in the direction of protection from unreal figures and magical beliefs. But this is not simply a version of our need for safety contending with our need for excitement. Freud is saying that our helplessness can force us into sacrificing by displacing the experience of satisfaction, which for Freud, in his early formulation in the project, is itself a fundamental precondition for psychic and physical survival. The experience of helplessness, in other words, can make us sacrifice our lives, can lure us into a nihilistic pact. If you give up on the experience of satisfaction, you can be protected. Of course, we don't want it to be as stark as this. We can, as we say, have both. And yet Freud, I think, is showing us something harsher, that there's something about our experience of helplessness, that there is perhaps something about the way helplessness is described, is presented in our culture at this time, that makes us want to give up on our desire, and for something that can supposedly reassure us, but not fundamentally satisfy us. As though the quest for the experience of satisfaction leaves us unprotected, and we will give up on satisfaction in order not to face this. Something about our helplessness or its description precipitates us into a delirium of compulsive protection seeking, as though we believe we can be protected from the great forces of life. In Freud's view, we are the animals who are uniquely vulnerable, oversensitive, one might say, to what living entails. We are sent into the world in a less finished state than other animals. The dangers of the external world have a greater importance for us, and we require barriers between ourselves and our desires. As Freud puts it, early differentiation between the ego and the id is promoted. But is this special pleading? In this account, are we rather like Richard, the exceptions, but in this case, the exceptions in the whole of nature? It's not, of course, difficult to see why Freud, at the time and place of writing, should feel his own and other people's unsuitedness, ill-fittingness to the world they found themselves in. Protection would be privileged over satisfaction for Jews and many others in Europe in the 20s and 30s. Fundamental human satisfactions might feel increasingly remote. There would be what we might think of, in short, as new forms of helplessness, new pictures and experiences of helplessness, political, economic, and in Freud's language, psychic. And these very experiences could lead to radical redescriptions of the helplessness of infancy, or what the consequences of helplessness can be. Helplessness could only become horrifying. It might be increasingly difficult to find, and perhaps it's always been difficult to find, inspiring pictures of helplessness, or accounts of helplessness that would make it sound, in Charles Taylor's words, something good to be, an object of our love or our allegiance. No one says things now like, he's a wonderfully helpless man, or there was something impressively helpless about the way she dealt with that. And yet Freud, I think, was beginning in the project to make the case, or a case for helplessness, for the fact that without the experience of helplessness, there could be no possibility for the experience of satisfaction. Without the possibility of the experience of satisfaction, life was futile. Indeed, one way of seeing what Freud thinks of as the magic of religious belief is that it contains a long-term wish within it, that one day I will feel sufficiently protected so I'll be able to get back to start up again on the quest for the experience of satisfaction. I'll be able to sort out my helplessness, secure myself from it, so the life of appetite can begin again. But in the meantime, I'm going to have to believe in God. The fantasy of ultimate redemption, at least in psychoanalytic terms, might mean a disguised picture of when I can allow myself to start desiring again, in the belief my desire will be met. In Freud's picture of appetite, both sexual and other, in the project, to desire, to be hungry or sexually alive, is to risk one's life. An education in helplessness, if such a thing were possible, and you might say we're already overeducated in helplessness, would be an education in moral risk and mortal risk. Clearly, a lot depends on what we feel about helplessness, on what, to put it as confoundingly as possible, can be done about it or with it. Could we, for example, in the pragmatist way, which is not the psychoanalytic way, use it to get from A to B, without the very idea of using it becoming a denial of its nature? What, to use William James's language, might helplessness be good for? In the project, after all, Freud was telling us that helplessness was good for the experience of satisfaction, that is what it was good for, and that was what was originally meant for. Of course, it seems odd to instrumentalize helplessness. But perhaps this is something we can't help but do, and this in itself may be instructive. Freud says in the instances I've cited that helplessness is good for the experience of satisfaction and good for making us magical, i.e. religious. It makes us enchant the world with supernatural agents and forces. But Freud is also saying that helplessness never stops, that in fact we get progressively more helpless. So we might say helplessness is only temporarily transformed by satisfaction, but that religious belief creates the illusion that it's permanently transformed. We are helpless, but our helplessness is grounded by help, the infinite help of God. And developmental theory in psychoanalysis fobs us off with the sense that helplessness can be progressively transformed. Because what Freud is urging us to imagine is what our lives would be like if we lived as if we were all helpless all the time, and that this helplessness was the very thing we sought to conceal or obscure or deny. That helplessness has no solution, there's no holding it at bay or growing out of it. That prior to sexuality or aggression or dependence, there is helplessness as a way of life, a way of being. That we are helplessly desiring creatures. That our original in both senses and fundamental helplessness could be recognized and acknowledged, and even to some extent met. Indeed, this is where object relations theory, attachment, relational psychoanalysis, and other stories about dependence come in. But in all these pictures, our helplessness is not temporarily relieved or assuaged or removed. It is just that so-called relationship is one of the things we do with or about our abiding and presiding helplessness. And if helpless is simply what we are, there is no other way of being, no way of being anything else, how and why have we made it such a problem? Or to put it the other way round, why have we not seen it, in Taylor's words, as something good to be, not just bad to be? Indeed, we have in a sense defined the good as that which relieves us of our helplessness or makes it bearable. So when Charles Taylor asks in Sources of the Self, what is it about the human subject that makes him recognize and love the good? One answer could be the subject's original helplessness. Our helplessness makes the good and the idea of the good integral, essential to our survival and well-being, whether the good is God or the mother or ideological commitments or moral convictions, or, as we say, the meeting of needs. There is an obvious religious point here which has broader implications. Fallen man was utterly helpless, Taylor writes, and could do nothing by himself. The point of harping on the helplessness and depravity of mankind was to throw into the starkest relief the power and mercy of God, who could bring about a salvation which was utterly beyond human power, and, what is more, still wanted to rescue his unworthy creature beyond all considerations of justice." End of quote. Our helplessness, then, in this usefully generalizable description, for God here we could put the mother, the parental couple, the saving ideology, and so on, is the precondition for our idea of the good. One could almost say it makes the idea of the good possible, even plausible. Without our original helplessness, such a thing would never have occurred to us. But there is a familiar moral move here that is worth noting. Helplessness has to be characterized as depravity, or lack, or weakness, to make the good look good. It's reminiscent of Nietzsche's striking point in On the Genealogy of Morals, when he writes of our, quote, will to establish an ideal, that of the holy God, and to feel the palpable certainty of our unworthiness with respect to that ideal. What if our casting of helplessness as weakness, as a form of depravity, has produced spurious forms of strength, of the good as that which relieves us of or even conceals our helplessness? When Freud implies in the project that we can satisfy each other but not save each other, we might take him to be saying satisfaction cumulatively experienced, or even satisfaction risked, can make helplessness a strength. Indeed, if, as Freud does, you make the experience of satisfaction and the frustration that leads to it into the constitutive human experiences, then helplessness, that is, the helplessness of appetite, of desiring, is our fundamental strength. Without it, there is no frustration, and therefore no possibility of the experience of satisfaction. Is helplessness only a good if and when we are helped? So if the good was to be formulated not as an overcoming of helplessness or a compensation for it or a denial of it, the good, in other words, was not itself believed to be without helplessness as God is, what would it be like? And my invoking of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals is, of course, a warning in the background, because the risk is, in promoting helplessness as a virtue, as an original strength, that we might simply be elaborating what Nietzsche calls, in his distasteful and exhilarating way, the slave revolt in morals, the tyranny of the weak over the strong, what he thinks of the corrupt and corrupting, quote, intelligence introduced by the powerless. Can we, in his terms, which I think are useful here, quote, approach the problems of morality in high spirits, by making the case for helplessness? Or does considering the sheer scale of our helplessness make us feel weaker, as though even talking about helplessness could drive us to despair or to sentimentality or to object relations or to drink? Why, in short, does helplessness make us think of consolation rather than inspiration? Why is it associated in our minds more with being tortured than being high-spirited, with being desperate rather than being available, with S&M rather than with abandon? You can either resent the way life is ordained or be intrigued by it, the critic Dennis Donahue rather grandly wrote. I think we're inclined and perhaps even encouraged, even educated, to resent our helplessness, to be frightened of it rather than intrigued by it. There is, of course, one sense in which our helplessness is not ordained. We're not born helpless, we become helpless. For the first years of our life, it never occurs to us, so to speak, that helpless is what we are. Helplessness is something that over time we learn about ourselves. It becomes the word we might use for certain experiences. And then it seems once we've got the idea, helplessness becomes the thing, the condition that we're always trying to do something about. Because we seek to relieve our helplessness, we think of it as something that we suffer or suffer from. But what if we thought of ourselves as getting progressively more helpless as we got older, and helplessness as something we grow into, partly by becoming aware of it? And in order to do this, we might have to broaden the analogy horizon. After all, we don't think of ourselves as relieving our need for oxygen by breathing, whereas we do think of ourselves as relieving our hunger with food. We can't satisfy our need not to be helpless. So by way of conclusion, I've got two suggestions, both in the spirit of Freud's The Creative Writer and Daydreaming. The true ars poetica, Freud writes in this paper, lies in the technique by which the artist overcomes our repulsion, which certainly has to do with the barriers that arise between each single ego and the others. I take it that there is something about our helplessness, the pictures we have of ourselves as helpless, that we find repulsive, and that the barriers that arise between each single ego and the others is in part at least a consequence of our disavowal of our original helplessness. That is the thing we have most originally in common with each other, such that the acknowledgement of this helplessness in common makes all such barriers between us seem wildly unrealistic. So my two suggestions are, firstly, that any psychoanalysis that privileges knowing over being, insight over experience, narrative over incoherence, diminishes, if not actually forecloses, our real acknowledgement of helplessness. If we thought of our helplessness as like a figure inside us, as, to use Hilary Putnam's phrase from another context, a being who breaks my categories, in a way we were willing to risk, we would not be only trying to overcome it, but as Freud intimates in the project, we would be trying to sustain it. We would think of our helplessness as sustaining us, there being nothing else ultimately that could do so. It would not simply be one of the best things about us, but it would be the thing, the condition without which we could not be who we are. In this picture, there's no version of ourselves that's not helpless, even if in different areas of our lives there are different forms of helplessness. We are helpless in different ways. And my second suggestion, following on from this, is that helplessness leads us too automatically into talking about dependence, and now, of course, attachment. When I was working on a ward for dying children, a mother once said to me, pointing to her daughter, "We are relying on her now." After all the doctors, after all the help that is available, we are ultimately helplessly dependent on our own bodies, on their sustaining vitality or lack of it. No other body is available but the body we happen to be. There can be virtues in necessity and in the fact that there are necessities. Thank you.
thank you for that beautiful moving talk. Adam Phillips has agreed to take questions for a while, and there will be, I believe, some microphones available for you at various points in the room. So once you're acknowledged, if you would just wait a second so the microphone can reach you, and everyone can then hear the question.
I may have misunderstood you, but I understood you to say that art spirits away helplessness. Maybe I got that phrase wrong, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about your view of art here. Do you think of it, for example, as what you called secular consolations, religion's double? How do you think of the relationship? Does art evoke helplessness? Does it satisfy us because it makes available helplessness?
I don't actually have a view about art, but what I was referring to was Freud suggesting that art can be used in the way that religious consolation can be. That is to say, it can be used to deny, preclude, foreclose the experience of helplessness. Not that it's intrinsically that, but that it could be used for that. And I think what Freud is trying to show us in a way, partly by exaggeration, is the repertoire of ways we have that are culturally sanctioned and valued that may actually be a refusal of the thing he feels is most valuable about us. So I think that's the point. It's about the use of it.
Hi, it's Kasia.
Hi.
I'm wondering about the status of the word satisfaction in your account, because helplessness, we are most helpless in relation to our finitude, to things that cannot be overcome or satisfied in any way. And if we're thinking about desire, which is another word that surfaced at various moments, at least from a Lacanian point of view, there would be no capacity to satisfy that either. And so Lacan talks about taking pleasure in our dissatisfaction.
Yeah. I think there's a distinction here, isn't there, which I think you're alluding to, which is that helplessness can't be satisfied. Desire, when we desire, there's the possibility of the approximation of satisfaction. But of course, it's the gap that sustains desire. But I think the point that the paper's making is that we can't satisfy our helplessness. But our helplessness is the consequence of things that allow us a certain amount of satisfaction. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think the word satisfaction implies something total.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I mean, it would be misleading to think that was the implication of the paper. Yeah. I don't feel that. Right. Because it wouldn't be that anything could be assuaged or ultimately appeased. It could be temporarily, as it were, held at bay, I think would be the best that might be hoped for. But that this would be an ongoing project.
Adam, I'm wondering about the eroticization of helplessness. That is to say, the various kinds of the sphere of the sexual as a place where people are in fact quite happy to be temporarily helpless and go to great lengths to make themselves helpless.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that the sexualization of helplessness or eroticization of it is the best thing we've come up with so far to make it a viable experience. And that seems to be a wonderfully ingenious artifact that one is able to do that. The only other thing that might be worth saying alongside that is, what is it about it that requires eroticization to make it a viable experience? Or what would it be like if we didn't eroticize it?
Absolutely brilliant talk. And I think about if we imagine our current culture, which we're a world of voracious appetites and incredible violence. We have missed this basic point. And I just try to imagine, is there some global community, some consciousness that might keep us from this, from where the path that we seem to be on?
Well, I don't know that. But I do think that, I do think two things. One is, it seems to me capitalism is really made for children. And the other thing is that what we need, in a way, is persuasive and eloquent accounts in praise of frustration. That a really good case needs to be made for the value of frustration that isn't to do with moral uplift. That would be my plan if I had one.
Yeah, your talk, I think, calls for a certain amount of free association in the listener. And in terms of the discourse, at least of maybe Northern California parents at this time, the word helpless enters one's own language, at least my language, when my children actually need help less. In other words, that when a child is truly helpless as a parent, right, or someone who has charge of that child, you don't think of them as helpless. And that the word helpless activates somehow that question of needing help more, needing help less, and becomes a kind of almost a term of rebuke, encouragement. And so, helplessness, free associating a little bit, is what I think the parent of an adolescent learns to do. It's a kind of state of paying attention, but not paying attention too much.
Well, just to associate to your point, two things occur to me. One is that one's own children's helplessness is unbearable at some level. And so one question would be why that is, and presumably it's partly because our own is unbearable. Let's say if we started from the position there was a fundamental solidarity of helplessness, it seems to me when our children were helpless, we'd think they're being people like us. The other point, I think, is to do with the helplessness of the parents in relation to the child. Because very often it seems to me, again, on the one hand you'd think, of course parents are helpless in relation to children. That's the point, not the problem. But the other bit of it, which I think is more subject to, as it were, social engineering, is that a lot of the rage, a lot of the helplessness that adults feel with children is narcissistic rage. That the child in these moments is affronting the adult's picture of what they need the child to be. And that too is a potentially instructive experience. Not that we can all be sort of Rodin's thinkers at the moment at which our children are having tantrums, but it seems to me it's possible to reflect on the way in which one is scandalized by one's child having desires that one doesn't want to include. And that also must be a part of the helplessness deal, it seems to me. That would be fundamentally acknowledged. And that, of course, one of the difficult things about being a parent is you have to frustrate your children. And one is helpless to do anything else, and it couldn't be otherwise. Indeed, the quest to satisfy one's children is a terrible thing. Terribly distracting thing. And that is the end of my sermon on child rearing.
I would like to ask a question which follows directly on the previous one. There's a marvelous professor in the psychology department here whose name I can't remember, but she wrote a book called The Scientist in the Crib. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. No. Well, the thesis very briefly is that the child in the first 3 or 4 years of life is training its parents. And I thought she said there's a lot of recent study which reinforces this. And so to me, it brings the question of what you really mean by helplessness, because the idea is that in some rather obvious senses, the child is helpless. But in fact, by the age of 4, it's in control. And the parents have been trained more or less to satisfy the needs. But you're not familiar with the word, but I wonder, to me, it gives this question about, you use the word helplessness a great deal, but in some sense, the children are often dominant by the age of 4.
Yes, but the wish to dominate would seem to me to be a primal self-cure for helplessness. I mean, you see, training wouldn't be my word, but I can see the point of the thesis you've described. There clearly is a sense in which children enable their parents to parent them, or that parents and children get used to each other in a certain way. But in order for this thesis, as you described it, to work, the parents have to have a willingness to be trained, in other words, a capacity to take this in. Now, the way in which it seems to be...
Not necessarily consciously.
No, not necessarily consciously. But one of the ways in which this has an inevitable limit to it is that we are all helpless, both in our desire, but also in our relative capacities to articulate our desire and in terms of what our desires evoke in other people, in the recipients. So that, I mean, I could put this simply by saying there's no such thing as an immaculate communication. And that will always be true, just by the nature of language, if you see what I mean. So that I think that, you know, there's a paradoxical thing involved in the parenting of young children, because obviously they don't speak. We then assume that speaking helps you desire. Of course, it does in a certain sense, but it also doesn't. There are different sets of ambiguities. But certainly the parent is having to imaginatively meet the young child's need. And every parent knows this can be very, very difficult. Simply because there is a helplessness in the face of human need. It doesn't mean because people do all sorts of things. People have brought up children for millions of years. Nevertheless, there is a helplessness in it that I think is structural.
Could you say more about what you meant when you said we should try and teach frustration as a good, or something to that effect? What about thinking actually that it is not a good that we can cultivate, because that would tend towards masochism, but just an inevitability that we have to learn to live with, and sooner or later we'll have to face?
Yes, it's the sooner or later that's the problem, isn't it? Because there are magical solutions to frustration which are called omnipotence or omniscience, or self-sufficiency, or a certain picture of narcissism. I mean, this is a difficult thing to think about, isn't it? Because if you take the basic picture of waiting, you could think on the one hand that it's as though waiting can go several ways. When I'm waiting for somebody I'm looking forward to seeing, I can look forward and look forward and look forward, and beyond a certain point, they turn into somebody I hate, don't want to see, and can't face when they arrive. So the question is, what can one do in one's waiting that sustains the desirability of the object, say? Now, in one set of descriptions in psychoanalysis, it is precisely in the waiting that the interesting things happen. That often the wish to gratify oneself preempts what the waiting might produce. So that it's as though in the waiting one can be in an omniscient state of mind, as in, I know what I want and I'm waiting for it. Whereas in the waiting period, it seems to me, the less knowable or the surprising desire might turn out or turn up. So I think the case for frustration is to do with improvisation, probably. It's something about what you can bear to let yourself feel and think when you're in something without turning a state of waiting into suspended animation. It would be like waiting and not waiting at the same time, but not denying either state.
Two things come to mind. One is T.S. Eliot, I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope. But also a meditation practice where you are forced to wait and not act through a lot of various kinds of unpleasures.
Yes, I mean, I don't know about that, but I would imagine that there must be a lot of spiritual practices that are about precisely this issue of, on the one hand, finding ways of waiting, or transforming the waiting experience into a non-waiting experience. As though you can want something more than the wanted object of desire.
I want to go back to this notion. Actually, you use the term suspended animation, and I want to get away from the notion of waiting, which seems to me very different from helplessness. It seems to me that the term helplessness, which is, I think, proliferating in the last 10 years, or has proliferated in the last 10 years, has a great deal to do with post 9/11 consciousness and the notion of forces that one is helpless to have any impact on. So that takes me away from the notion of dependence as well. I think that there's a big difference between the term helplessness and the term dependence in its links. Dependence, assuming that there is some other, and that's the move towards satisfaction that you were talking about, that one can, some object of desire that one can connect with, or object of protection that one can connect with. But I think the notion of helplessness seems more to do with the fact that there isn't, and seems more related to the kind of nightmare of paralysis in which something catastrophic is about to happen and one has no possibility of having an effect. So I wonder if I'm understanding your notion of helplessness as dependence.
Well, I don't know whether you are or not, but what I intended to say in the paper is that the risk is that the idea of dependence becomes a false cure for helplessness, as though theories of dependence are manifestly meeting the problem of helplessness, but may actually be shying away from it. That's one point. The other point is that obviously we're not short of very, very bad pictures of helplessness. I mean, I think we can take those for granted. What I'm interested in is whether there are good ones. That's, say, desirable states of mind that one might feel to be morally good, worth cultivating or creating, that would involve us in a new kind of relationality, both to others and to ourselves. So that seems to me to be the interesting imaginative project, because very quickly, it seems to me, when we think about helplessness, we think about awful things. And there's a good reason for that. It's not that we've got this wrong, but I think it's not the whole story. That's all.
The basic model of helplessness underlying everything you said, including all the authors that you mentioned, is the helplessness of the neonate. And you've examined certain models of dealing with that don't lead to such good solutions, others that can be illusory, magic, religion, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me that the one model of helplessness that is not dealt with at all in any of the authors that you mentioned, or in your own thinking, is the helplessness of the fact of death, not being born and being helpless at that time. Because as you said yourself, biologically, for over millions of years, we have developed mechanisms for dealing with that helplessness. If we hadn't, we would not exist as a species. But we have not dealt with at all, or almost at all. We create religions for it, but we know what we think of them. If you've read your Freud, we have not dealt with death.
Do
you haven't in your paper.
And there are lots of things I haven't dealt with, I'm sure you're right about that. But do you not think it's strange that we should think of, that we should feel helpless in the face of death? I mean, that seems to me a very strange thing. As though, I didn't say it is, as though we could come up with something else in relation to it, as though we could be masterful in the face of death, or undisturbed by it, or I don't know what the relevant vocabulary would be. I think one of the things I said in the paper, and obviously I'm not an authority in this paper, but I do think that one of the things that Freud is saying, and I'm certainly saying, is that helplessness is all-pervasive. That is to say, it infiltrates every area of our life in which we make claims to being powerful. Indeed, the very claims to being powerful are signs of our helplessness. That seems to me to be the basic point. And it's a very, very simple one.
Several times in your paper, you referred to deformity, that is, the way in which we conceive of helplessness as a condition of deformity. And you raised as a question where we would derive an idea of form that is not deformed. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, I suppose the difficult thing is to imagine, and the Richard example is used for this. If we are deformed by being helpless, what would it be not to be deformed? Well, I think the answer is omnipotent, to be a god, to be somebody for whom this is not an issue, for somebody for whom this, this wouldn't occur as a question. And it seems to me that is the, this isn't really the right way of putting it, but that would be the self-sabotaging part of the self that takes flight into the belief that this is a deformation, as though there was another way of doing this. And that's Richard's solution. It seems to me an awful lot of violence is precisely that.
Adam, you say two things in the course of the paper, and I'd like to ask you how they line up. One is that there is, as you tease out from Freud, an original helplessness. And the other, I think you say, is that we are not born helpless, we grow into helplessness. How do those two ideas line up?
That our original helplessness is a view from outside, so to speak. In other words, the baby and young child isn't saying, "Oh God, I'm helpless." So that helplessness is something we acquire a sense of through acculturation. And that in itself seems to me an interesting part of this story. Yeah. Because that would be obviously where, for want of a better word, education would come in. Why is it called helplessness, or what are the implications of that? So that's the link.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. I have no problem with feeling helpless. That makes sense. You know, we're so interdependent. As far as models of it, a couple things occurred to me. One was the holy fool, or another was the idea of mystery, or the idea of unknowability. We can't all know everything. The idea that we can is itself a delusion. And then in Buddhist practice, of course, major hindrances are either desire or aversion. So it seems to me there are models for a good helplessness.
Mm. No, I imagine there must be. I just don't know what they are. And those sound like good ones.
In listening to your talk, it seems to me that the recovery movement is one of the manifestations of how society, one of the ways it deals with this. And also interesting that it comes out of Victorian culture. Do you have any experience or thought about that as a way people deal with the issue of helplessness?
Sorry, can you say a bit more of that? What do you mean by the recovery movement?
This sort of 12-step program that started in Oxford in the 19th century that is now Alcoholics Anonymous and all these other offshoots of groups, as a way of acknowledging helplessness and not solving it, perhaps.
Well, one of the things about those kind of treatments is that they are a kind of appeal to the will. That the implication, I mean, and the self-help movement is obviously partly to do with this, and the limitation here is that very often the things people suffer from are beyond their will, which is why they're in that position anyway. And you could think, the will is, which certainly isn't a term used in psychoanalysis, was, so to speak, invented to give one the illusion that one could do things about oneself and one's predicament and one's condition. Indeed, one might be able to do this solo. And I suppose one of the things I like about psychoanalysis is that it doesn't work. That it's the treatment that it could never work. But the ways in which it doesn't work are more illuminating than the ways in which other treatments do work, I think.
Let's take maybe one more.
Yeah, I also thought it was a brilliant talk, and in fact, helpful. It felt to me that as a kind of tone poem essay, as an exercise in point of view, we were in the position of the helpless infant, or Richard III, and that was our only conversation ever with the world. And it struck me that there is a developmental point, startling moment when the child, the infant, once they can get, I forget when it happens, when they get their head up and they actually try to put things in your mouth, that what's left out of this is an account of agency as a stage of human development, that I don't think it solves the problem of helplessness, but it initiates a different conversation between self and other that seems our usual solution to that, or a parallel conversation between desire and the world?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think in a way, what the paper must be thinking about is what does agency become in the light of fundamental helplessness? You know, in other words, how would you be led to redescribe agency if you took this kind of helplessness for granted and as something that could never be overcome? So there would be no story of mastery or becoming progressively less helpless. In fact, you'd be becoming progressively more helpless in my world. And then the question would be, well, what would agency be for? Well, one of the things it might be for would be to enable one to become more helpless. It would be something like that. But you're right, that's the moment, certainly in the child's development, when they begin to have a sense of what we call, on their behalf, autonomy. And the risk then is that that becomes kind of sacralized as the magical, progressive estrangement from helplessness, and therefore self-reliance and autonomy. And it could be actually a contributor to helplessness, I think.
Please join me in thanking Adam Phillips so much. Thank you. Really, really nice.